The Song of Ice and Fire is, as the title suggests, a dance between the physical manifestations of ice and fire. In this sprawling world of war, intrigue, and illicit magic, ice is made manifest in the bitter wastes of the land past the wall, and the others who dwell beyond. Fire, however, is made manifest in the form of great-scaled beasts and their platinum-haired riders. This is a special long-form video on the entire history of House Targaryen, where we'll cover everything from their earliest origins, their 300-year-long reign over Westeros, and their ultimate demise. Join us as we explore the history of a family whose history so poetically echoes its house words, fire and blood. You might think that fire and blood would make good passwords, if you were as mad as a Targaryen. No, your digital house words need to be a lot more complicated to survive now, but it can actually be made very easy with our sponsor, NordPass, who have a special offer at our link in the description. Everyone knows by now you're supposed to use unique and difficult to generate passwords for everything. The problem being, of course, that the amount of things that need passwords has run out of control, and half the time you have to use the same old password just to have any chance of keeping access to your nebulous sea of accounts. Instead, use NordPass. It's a program you run on your computer or mobile device that handles all your password business. When you start an account, it will generate a password strong as dragon scales. It's securely stored, hidden on your device, and whenever you log in again, NordPass automatically writes the magical code in for you, and away you go. It's both safer and easier than doing it in your head. NordPass can analyze and improve your old passwords too, let you know if your password has been leaked online, and it's all heavily encrypted so that only you can use it on up to 6 devices. As for our offer, you can get a bonus month of NordPass for free if you check it out via our link in the description, or use our code WIZARDS&WARRIORS at checkout. Give it a go. The reign of the Targaryens as the royal house of Westeros is a relatively recent phenomenon, beginning around 300 years ago, and ending only a single generation ago. However, the bloodlines of the silver-haired dragon riders are much older than that, and to explore the historical roots of House Targaryen's ascendancy, we must go back not centuries but millennia. To that end, we turn our gaze not onto Westeros, but her sister continent to the east, Essos, where the mighty Valyrian freehold, the greatest civilization in the history of the world, once thrived. Around 5,000 years ago, many mighty civilizations blanketed the massive landmass of Essos, including the tall men of Sarnor, the 1,000 jeweled cities of Yi, and Old Geese, the empire of the Golden Harpy. During this ancient time, the Valyrian Peninsula was the backwater of Essos, with the Valyrians themselves being little more than humble shepherds. This, however, would change when some of these humble sheepherders decided to brave the slopes of the 14 Flames, a ring of volcanoes on their native peninsula. There, living in those molten craters, the Valyrians discovered the sentient embodiment of power and flame, the dragons. How the Valyrians tamed the dragons is unclear. The process was certainly born of some sort of magic, with some legends claiming said magic was taught to the Valyrians by a vanished people from the Shadowlands of Ashai. In any case, within a few generations, the Valyrians were shepherds no longer, and soared the Great Blue atop massive draconic beasts. Bolstered by the limitlessness of the skies and an explosion of magical advancement, the Valyrian Peninsula grew from a forgotten backwater into a vibrant cultural hub. In the titular capital city of Valyria, glittering silver spiral towers reached for the heavens, and the rich and powerful lived comfortable lives, pampered by the comforts brought on by the innovations of dragonfire and blood magic. Technically speaking, Valyria was never an empire or kingdom, for it had no crowned head. Instead, it was ruled by a council of 24 or so of its most powerful dragon-riding families, making it a freehold. Armed with the fantasy equivalent of weapons of mass destruction, it was inevitable that the Valyrians would eventually expand out of their native peninsula with conquest in mind. Ironically though, their path to imperial expansion began with them being attacked. Wary of Valyria's growing power, the slavers of Old Geese, who dominated most of Essos at the time, marched their lockstep legions into the Valyrian peninsula 5 times to subjugate them. However, each time the Valyrians defeated the Sons of the Harpy, for they had dragons, and the Giscari had none. In the last of the Giscari Wars, the Valyrians obliterated Old Ghis, the ancient capital of the Giscari Empire, and annexed the lands around Slavers Bay. There, the Valyrians picked up the habit of slavery from the empire they had just vanquished. In the following centuries, the Dragon Lords of Valyria would spread their power and influence throughout nearly all of western and central Essos by right of conquest made possible by dragonfire. Around 2,000 years ago, they annexed the northern hills of Andalos. The native peoples of that land, the titular Andals, thus fled in exodus across the narrow sea to Westeros, where they conquered the first men and the children of the forest. To this day, the population of Westeros is of predominantly Andal ancestry because of this, with the exception of the north, where the first men were never conquered. After conquering Andalos, the Valyrians, or more specifically the budding Valyrian colony of Volantis, turned their sights onto Rhoynar, a people who lived in a series of city-states along the titular Rhoyne River, and whose history was just as ancient and storied as Old Ghis. Subduing the Rhoynar took the better part of 2 centuries, for the Rhoynish were possessed of powerful water magic, which was capable of countering dragonfire. However, about 700 years ago, a massive Valyrian army, accompanied by 350 dragons, the largest number of the beasts ever assembled, completely incinerated the armies of Rhoynar. After this, a Rhoynish princess, Nymeria, led what remained of her people in an exodus from her homeland aboard 10,000 ships. They sailed west to Westeros, where they landed in Dorne. To this day, the people of Dorne are predominantly of Rhoynish ancestry, marking the second time the conquests of the Valyrians impacted the ethnic makeup of the western continent. Over the next few centuries, the Valyrian freehold came to stretch over most of Essos west of the Bone Mountains. Great Valyrian colonies, such as Volantis, Tyrosh, Lys, Myr and Pentos, became autonomous, self-governing cities under the suzerainty of the capital back in the Valyrian Peninsula, and as such, grew into wealthy and powerful centres of commerce and culture in their own right. The world, it seemed, belonged to the Valyrians, and no one could forgive them for believing that the sun would never set on their glorious empire. And yet, doom was on the horizon. Throughout the history of the Valyrian freehold, House Targaryen was considered a minor power. Possessed of dragons, yes, but politically unimportant. In 114 BC, about 400 years ago, a scion of the humble house, Daenerys Targaryen, had a vision in which Valyria was subject to a great destruction. Considering this vision to be prophetic, the Targaryens abandoned the Valyrian capital and moved to the island of Dragonstone on the Narrow Sea. The rest of the Valyrian dragon lords paid them no mind. House Targaryen had always been on the political periphery of the freehold. If they wanted to move to the geographical periphery of the empire, then so be it. Moreover, they believed Daenerys' apocalyptic visions to be delirious nonsense. They could not have been more wrong. In 105 BC, a great doom befell the Valyrian Peninsula. What exactly caused this doom is unknown, but it was catastrophic. Pillars of hellish white-hot flame erupted from the earth with such heat and power that the capital city was utterly obliterated, and even dragons, creatures born of fire, were incinerated. The peninsula itself was rended, the land breaking apart from intense seismic activity. By the end of the doom, the city of Valyria was no more, and all the freehold's most powerful dragon lords and their dragons had perished. Although the colony cities Valyria once established, like Lys, Pentos and Volantis, would survive, the freehold as a unified state had collapsed, and the dragons they had conquered the world with had gone extinct, with one exception. The Targaryen dragon lords were alive and well on Dragonstone, and so were their massive draconic mounts, making them the last dragon riders in the world. Thus the world looked upon the Targaryens with trepidation. Would they turn their gaze back east and use their status as the world's last dragon holders to reform the Valyrian freehold with themselves as its masters? Or would they look west to new lands and new horizons? The Targaryens, with their dragons and their allies, houses Valerian and Celtigar, now controlled the crucial trade routes from Westeros to Essos. Despite this, the Dragon Lords of Dragonstone took little interest in Westeros for the next 100 years. This would all change with the birth of Aegon, who was born in 27 BC and had two sisters, the older Visenya and the younger Rhaenys. It was Valyrian custom to marry brother to sister, so Aegon married both. In their youth, the siblings began to occasionally visit Westeros on their dragons as guests of several local lords. Westeros was divided into 7 constantly warring kingdoms. In the north, the Starks ruled from their castle at Winterfell. To the far south in the Dornish deserts, House Martell reigned from Sunspear. The gold-rich Westerlands were dominated by House Lannister, while the neighbouring House Gardener held dominion over the fertile lands of the Reach, and the mountainous realm of the Vale belonged to House Arryn. Closest to Aegon's sphere of influence were House Hoare's expansionist kingdom and that of the declining Storm Kings of House Durrandon. They had once ruled half of Westeros, but their realm had been chipped away at by their neighbours for decades. The leader of Hoare, Harren the Black, had almost completed a colossal castle named Harrenhal, and would soon be able to pursue new conquests in the Stormlands. Fearing this threat, Argilac Durrandon sent an envoy to Dragonstone, offering his daughter's hand in marriage, along with the land from the God's Eye to the Trident as a dowry, attempting to establish the Valyrians as a buffer between him and the Iron Islanders. However, Aegon instead offered marriage with his friend and rumoured bastard brother, Orys Baratheon. Angered by this insulting proposal, Argilac cut the hands off the envoy and sent them back to Aegon, stating, "These are the only hands your bastard shall have of me." In response, Aegon summoned his friends, allies and bannermen to Dragonstone. The Velaryons and Celtigars answered their lord's call dutifully. They were joined by the Emmons and Masseys, who despite being sworn to the Durrandons, had closer ties to the Dragon Lords. After 7 days of council, a cloud of ravens burst from Dragonstone to all corners of the 7 kingdoms, carrying one message. From this day forth, there would be but one king in Westeros. Those who bent the knee would keep their lands and titles. Those who resisted would be humbled and destroyed. In 2 BC, Aegon set sail from Dragonstone with his sisters, 3 dragons, and a few hundred to a few thousand retainers. This was the force which landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush and proceeded to encamp on the largest of 3 hills in the area, starting the construction of the Aegon Fort. The Targaryen would-be king quickly constructed a makeshift palisade and dispatched Rhaenys and Visenya on their dragons, Meraxes and Vhagar, to secure nearby castles. Rhaenys captured Rosby without a fight, and Visenya was attacked briefly until she showed Vhagar's power, and the defenders surrendered. Nearby houses Darklyn and Mooten saw the threat, and marched south with 3,000 men to attack Aegon's beachhead. The Dragon Lord placed Orys in command of his ground forces, while he descended on the enemy from above on his own dragon, the monstrous Balerion the Black Dread. Both enemy commanders were killed, and these castles bent the knee. After subduing a dozen castles, Aegon summoned their lords. As they had bent the knee, he raised them up and confirmed their lands and titles, whilst to his oldest supporters he granted council positions. Daemon Valerian was made Master of Ships, Tristan Massey Master of Laws, and Crispian Celtigar Master of Coin. Above all others, he placed Orys Baratheon, his greatest confidant, as the first Hand of the King. After this, Aegon's knights unfurled a great 3-headed red dragon banner, breathing fire on a black field. The lords gathered now truly knew Aegon was one of them and a worthy High King. Queen Visenya then placed a Valyrian steel crown on his head, while Queen Rhaenys hailed him as Aegon, first of his name, King of all Westeros and Shield of his people. While those in attendance hailed their new ruler, the 7 kings of Westeros were preparing for the war that was soon to come. Within days of the coronation, Aegon's armies marched once again in 3 directions. The Targaryen fleet left for Gulltown and the Vale, accompanied by Visenya. The king thrust northwest towards Harrenhal, while the majority of his forces, commanded by Orys Baratheon, crossed the Blackwater Rush accompanied by Rhaenys. Their vanguard was ambushed as they crossed the Wendwater River, and they lost 1,000 men before Rhaenys burned their attackers' forest hiding place to the ground. Meanwhile, in the north, Aegon and Balerion obliterated King Harren and his entire family by bypassing the walls of the fortress and melting its stone towers. This, and the news that Rhaenys and Meraxes accompanied the Targaryen forces invading the Stormlands, worried Argilac, and he began to gather his men at Storm's End. He wasn't going to meet the same fate as Harren, and so he began his march north to meet the army of Orys. The airborne Rhaenys witnessed Argilac's departure and the composition of the enemy army, reporting the details back to the Hand of the King. Realizing the Storm King's army outnumbered his, he set up a strong defensive position on the hills south of Bronzegate and dug in, awaiting the arrival of his enemy. As Argilac closed on the invading force in the morning, a steady rain began to fall, which then became a howling gale and torrential downpour, turning the ground into a soft mud and also rendering Meraxes unable to fly. The Battle of the Last Storm had begun. Argilac's commanders urged the Storm King to delay his attack until the next day, in hopes that the rain would pass. But the Stormlander army outnumbered the army of Orys 2-1, and had 4 times the amount of armoured knights and heavy horses. Angered by the dragon banners flapping on his own hills, and noting that the rain and wind was blowing north, into the invading army's face, the king gave the command to attack. Argilac's heavy knights galloped through the rain across the mud-soaked battlefield and up the hill, crashing into the Targaryen spearmen at the summit. However, the uphill charge, in addition to the sticky mud, bogged down the knights' warhorses, and the charge lost its coordinated momentum and cohesion. Giving the order for the knights to pull back to the bottom of the hill, the Storm King led his knights twice more in charges up the hill, attempting to break through the enemy centre. But the assaults became less effective with each attempt, as the ground was ploughed up by the previous charges. Finally, the battered and broken knight formations were called back to regroup, the Targaryen pikemen only having suffered light casualties. Instead, the king's army sent its spear-bearing infantry up the hill to attack the enemy flank. And with the invaders blinded by the heavy rainfall, they did not see Argilac's men until it was too late. Orys's archers attempted to shower them with a rain of arrows, but the weather had made their bows useless. The hills anchoring the Targaryen left and right flank fell to the enemy, and reserves from the centre had to be sent to bolster the line. Then, Argilac led his knights in a final charge up the hill, which broke the enemy centre. But they now crashed against Rhaenys and Meraxes, and the Dragon Queen proceeded to slaughter the knights of the king's personal vanguard and one of his commanders with Dragonflame. The other warhorses, frightened by the roaring dragon's fire, panicked and fled in terror, crashing into the riders behind them and turning the charge into chaos. King Argilac himself was thrown from his saddle, but continued to battle on the hill. The Targaryen forces now gained the upper hand, and Orys Baratheon charged down the hill towards Argilac, who had slain many soldiers by himself. The invading commander offered a final chance to yield, which was refused. The two now fought, and each wounded their opponent once. After a fierce duel, Argilac was killed and his army routed. With the army of the Stormlands destroyed, Orys Baratheon's host marched on Storm's End, which was surrendered by the garrison along with the late king's daughter, whom Orys then married, forming House Baratheon. Meanwhile, to the west, hearing of Argilac's defeat, the King of the Rock, Lor I Lannister, and King of the Reach, Mern IX Gardener, had combined their forces at Castle Goldengrove, creating the mightiest host the kingdoms had ever seen. The two kings quickly marched northeast through the fields and crops of mid-Westeros. Advised of their march at his camp near the God's Eye, Aegon was able to move south much quicker than his foes, as he had a smaller force. When they arrived at the Stony Sept, his queens with their dragons joined him. The two armies came together on the wide-open plains south of the Blackwater Rush, which were covered in dry grass and wheat as far as the eye could see. The sun shone down severely on the unshielded plains and seared the land, as there had been no rain for more than a fortnight. Wind also blew strongly across the flat land. The allied Lannister-Gardener army sent scouts to perform reconnaissance against the invaders, and they returned with good news. Aegon's host was small, and theirs was massive. 32,500 soldiers from the Reach took to the field that day, including several hundred vassal lords of House Gardener and several thousand mounted knights. 22,500 Lannister levies also accompanied them, again with several hundred lords of the Westerlands and several thousand mounted knights. As King Mern had brought more men to the field than King Loren, he demanded the honour of commanding the centre for his house. His son Edmund and himself commanded this armoured wedge of knights, while Lorc Oakheart led the left and the King of the Rock commanded the right flank. In total, this army consisted of around 55,000 troops. Opposite them, Aegon formed up his own army in a crescent facing towards the enemy line. His front ranks consisted of spears and pikemen, with archers and crossbowmen behind them, while light cavalry manned both flanks. Most of the soldiers under Aegon's banner were untested and consisted of the levies of the recently allied Riverlords, whose loyalty to the Targaryen cause was far from certain. Outnumbered 5-1, the Targaryen host probably numbered around 11,000 soldiers and was commanded by Jon Mooton, Lord of Maidenpool, while the Targaryen royals circled overhead on their 3 dragons. The two kings sounded their trumpets and began marching forward under a sea of banners. King Mern led the heavy cavalry charge against the enemy centre on his golden stallion. While the Targaryen archers and crossbowmen dealt some damage to the charging knights, it was not enough. The first line of spearmen was swept aside, and a bloody battle began. The conflict seemed like it would be a massacre in favour of the allied army, but then a great roar was heard, and the 3 dragons began to descend from the skies. Rhaenys set fires in front of the enemy army, the wind blowing the produced acrid smoke towards and blinding them and their mounts, who also began to panic. Visenya on Vagar used their dragon flame to cut off any possible withdrawal, while Aegon flew over the massive host and continuously bathed it in flame. The remainder of the Targaryen ground force, who were safely upwind of the conflagration, waited with bow and spear, ready to make short work of the burned and burning men periodically emerging from the inferno. By the end of the day, over 4,000 allied soldiers perished in the dragon fire, and over 20,000 suffered burns, while another 1,000 died by conventional weaponry. The Targaryen force suffered less than 100 dead. King Mern and his entire family perished in the inferno, while the King of the Rock promptly bent the knee to Aegon. The victor marched to secure Highgarden and eventually installed House Tyrell as the new Lords of the Reach. A few months later, both King Torrhen Stark and Shara Arryn pledged their loyalty. Although Dorne continued to resist for over a century, the Targaryens ascended to the Iron Throne of Westeros. After bringing 6 out of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros under his rule, King Aegon I Targaryen enjoyed a 4-decade-long reign over the massive realm which he and his sister wives had won by the right of Dragonfire. The Seminole Conqueror's regime was a relatively prosperous one. Aegon Fort, the wooden palisade built upon the site of the Targaryens' first landing, was torn down and replaced with a structure more befitting of a king, the Red Keep. Over time, a vibrant and prosperous city grew around this seat of royal power, known fittingly as King's Landing. Targaryen rule was now more or less uncontested from Old Town to Castle Black. However, while large swaths of Westeros prospered peacefully under their rule, the reign of the House of the Dragon would remain defined by its house words, fire and blood. In 4 AC, Aegon continued where he had left off, seeking to bring Dawn, the last independent kingdom of Westeros, under his rule. However, where the great lords of the other 6 kingdoms had marched to meet the Conqueror's dragons on the open field and been drowned in hellfire as a result, the children of Rhoynar refused to engage the winged weapons of mass destruction on the Targaryens' terms. Hiding amidst arid hills and desert sands, the Dornish fought like snakes in the grass, stubbornly refusing to submit, even as their cities, towns and castles were burned from on high. Then, remarkably, in 10 AC, a Dornish scorpion ballista managed to pierce the eye of Meraxes, sending the massive she-dragon and her rider, sister Queen Rhaenys Targaryen, plunging to their deaths. It was the first time a dragon had been killed in battle on Westerosi shores. 4 years later, a defeated Aegon withdrew his troops from Dorne, leaving the conquest of that stubborn kingdom as a task for his descendants. Aegon the Conqueror died in 37 AC, succeeded by his eldest son, Aenys I Targaryen. Immediately, the young king faced no less than 5 rebellions, the worst of which being perpetrated by the militant branches of the Faith of the Seven, who considered the Targaryens' habit of marrying brother to sister an intolerable sin. These rebellions were eventually crushed, although at the cost of the lives of King Aenys and his heir. In 48 AC, the throne passed to King Jaehaerys I Targaryen, who ruled for a marathon 55 years, during which time he made peace with the church, and more or less stabilized the Targaryens' hold over all Westeros sans Dawn. However, as is the nature of the world of ice and fire, stability never lasts long, and soon the mighty House Targaryen would find itself embroiled in a savage interdynastic war of succession which would ultimately begin the long decline of their regime, the Dance of the Dragons. At the centennial of Targaryen rule, the Iron Throne was occupied by one Viserys I Targaryen, whose wife, the Queen Aemma Arryn, had borne him no living sons. Despite this, King Viserys had one adult daughter, Princess Rhaenyra, who he named his heir in 105 AC. For her part, Rhaenyra was a clever and capable stateswoman who quickly embraced her role and began gathering support of many of the landed lords in her father's royal court. However, upon the death of Queen Arryn, King Viserys remarried, this time to one Alicent Hightower, with whom he had a son, Aegon. This created a quandary among the feudal lords of Westeros. Among the Andals and the First Men, the law of male primogeniture predominated, by which a lord's eldest son was always the legal inheritor of his father's lands. By that token, there arose an issue. According to Westerosi succession laws, Aegon, son of King Viserys by Queen Alicent, should be the rightful heir to the throne. However, despite it running against the custom of male primogeniture, the king had already named his eldest child, the female Princess Rhaenyra, to be his successor. Over time, 2 factions began coalescing within the royal court, one made up of notable nobles who supported Prince Aegon's claim to the throne, and one made up of other nobles who supported Princess Rhaenyra. King Viserys, a pleasant, humble and amiable man, was unable or simply unwilling to deal with the deadly fissures forming within the Red Keep. In 111 AC, during a great tourney held in King's Landing, these factions were given names, as Aegon's mother Queen Alicent wore a gown of green to the affair, while Princess Rhaenyra wore black. Thus, supporters of Aegon became known as the Greens, and supporters of Rhaenyra the Blacks. On the 3rd day of the 3rd moon of 129 AC, a servant entered the royal chambers in the Red Keep, only to find that King Viserys, ancient and feeble, had died in his sleep. The humble chamberlain rushed to inform Queen Alicent of her husband's passing. Should the late king's wishes have been honoured, then Alicent should have sent a raven to Dragonstone Keep, the seat of Princess Rhaenyra, and informed her to come to King's Landing to take the Iron Throne as the king's chosen heir. However, the queen had other plans. Throwing the servant into the black cells to ensure word of Viserys' death would not spread to the public, she ordered a secret meeting of the small council, with the aim of persuading them to recognize her son, Aegon, as ruler in Rhaenyra's stead. The council was deeply torn. On one hand, Viserys had made his court swear fealty to Princess Rhaenyra as his heir 20 years ago, but on the other, Prince Aegon was male, and by law of primogeniture, males come before females. Eventually, Sir Criston Cole, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, made a very convincing argument on Prince Aegon's behalf when he slit the throat of Lord Leman Beesbury, Master of Coin, and Rhaenyra's staunchest supporter within the council. None were more surprised by the small council's decision to crown Prince Aegon than Aegon himself, who at first was reluctant to take the crown, knowing it would be going against his late father's wishes. This humility was smacked out of him by his mother, who, probably correctly, convinced him that Rhaenyra was not wont to reward such loyalty and was more likely to simply slit the young prince's throat to remove him as a threat. Thus, 7 days after the death of King Viserys, King Aegon Targaryen, second of his name, ascended unto the Iron Throne of Westeros. Days later, word of this reached Princess Rhaenyra in Dragonstone. Presently pregnant with her 4th child, the shock of her siblings' betrayal induced her to miscarry the baby. This tragedy, however, was not enough to deter Rhaenyra from claiming her inheritance. At Dragonstone, she gathered her loyal supporters and formed a new government, the Black Council. Thus, war was on. A war that would leave Westeros bathed in fire and ruin, as a brother and sister shed the blood of thousands over a dynastic spat, which in turn would see the power and prestige of House Targaryen take a fatal blow from which it would never recover. Indeed, before the imminent Dance of the Dragons, House Targaryen had 18 dragons to command. By the war's end, all but 2 would have been slain. While lords and notables from across Westeros's many noble houses would inevitably involve themselves in the war between King Aegon and Princess Rhaenyra, the Dance of the Dragons was at heart an interdynastic dispute. Thus, with both sides of the conflict led by various peoples named Targaryen, it is necessary to break down which Targaryens served on which side to belay the inevitable confusion. Among the chief supporters of King Aegon's faction, Aegon the Greens, was the young king's younger brother, Aemond Targaryen. Rider of the dragon Vagar, Aemond was possessed of a legendary temper. Having lost an eye in a grudge match with his cousin at the tender age of 10, he encrusted a sapphire into the empty socket where the eye had once been. King Aegon also had a second younger brother, Daeron, who was gentler and more charming than Aemond, but a dragon rider and a capable warrior all the same. On the other side, Princess Rhaenyra's Black Council included her 3 eldest sons, Jaehaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey Targaryen, each one a dragon rider. Present also was the 55-year-old Lady Rhaenys Targaryen, sister of the late King Viserys, rider of the massive worm Meleys, and wife to Corlys Velaryon, owner of the largest fleet in the realm. Finally, chief among Rhaenyra's supporters was her uncle and husband, Prince Daemon Targaryen, rider of the mighty dragon Caraxes, and widely considered to be the most dangerous man in Westeros. At the onset of the war, King Aegon had the loyalty of the majority of Westeros's great lords, and in comparison, Rhaenyra's support across the realm was very limited. However, the Black Princess had one major advantage. While Aegon's faction only had 4 dragons, hers had 11, albeit only 6 presently had riders. This gave Rhaenyra a potent advantage in firepower, but this alone would not carry her to victory, for while dragons can burn down a city, it took armies to conquer and hold it. To that end, Queen Rhaenyra opted to use diplomacy, sending out 2 of her sons to parley with the great feudal lords of Westeros to earn their support. In the Eyrie, White Harbour and Winterfell, Prince Jaehaerys found success, as the Arryns of the Vale pledged their loyalty to Rhaenyra, as did the Starks of Winterfell and their prosperous Manderly allies. However, when the Black Princess's middle child, Lucerys, arrived upon the lands of the Baratheons atop his dragon Arrax, he did not find himself so lucky. When granted an audience in Storm's End, he found the Lord Borros Baratheon, flanked by none other than Aemond Targaryen, standing stoically at the Stormlord's side. The Baratheons had already declared for King Aegon, and Lucerys was told to leave. His diplomatic mission a failure, the young princeling mounted himself atop Arrax and began the flight back to Dragonstone. He would never make it. As a storm raged over Shipbreaker Bay, another pair of bronze wings cut through the din. Aemond, riding atop his massive worm Vagar, had descended upon his prey. What followed was more a murder than a fight, for Vagar was a much bigger dragon than Arrax, and Aemond a much more skilled rider than Lucerys. 3 days later, the scaled body of Arrax and his young rider washed up on the beach outside Storm's End. Upon hearing of her son's death, Princess Rhaenyra collapsed into a spiral of grief, and her will to continue the fight was broken. Until, that is, 2 pieces of news arrived from her husband, Prince Daemon. Firstly, the Castellan of Harrenhal, no doubt remembering how Dragonfire had roasted King Harren in that very same castle 130 years earlier, bloodlessly surrendered the keep to the Blacks after Prince Daemon landed atop its battlements on his hulking dragon Caraxes. This put the most important castle, and by extension most of the Riverlands, under Rhaenyra's control. Secondly, word had also reached Daemon of Lucerys' death, and he promised that he would avenge the boy. To that end, Daemon reached out to 2 old contacts of his in King's Landing, a former sergeant in the City Watch, known by the alias of Blood, and a rat catcher who worked in the Red Keep, known by the alias of Cheese. These 2 humble, low-born lowlifes would be the Black Council's instrument of vengeance. As long-time servants of the royal family, both Blood and Cheese knew every nook and cranny of the Red Keep, and thus were able to sneak into the royal bedchambers undetected. One night, as Helaena, sister queen of King Aegon, was tucking her children into bed, the 2 assassins burst into her chambers and barred the door behind her. They put her sons, Maelor and Jaehaerys, under knife point and told her that in order to avenge Lucerys' death, a life was owed, and the queen had to choose which of her 2 sons was to be killed. Pleading for the 2 thugs to kill her instead, to no avail, the queen eventually cried out that Maelor, the younger of her boys, was to be struck down, perhaps because Jaehaerys was King Aegon's eldest son and heir. Upon hearing this command, Blood slit Jaehaerys' throat instead. The 2 assassins then fled, leaving a delirious Queen Helaena lying with Maelor, who would live the rest of his life knowing his mother had chosen him to die. An eye for an eye, a son for a son. After the deaths of Lucerys and Jaehaerys, both the Greens and the Blacks had committed egregious acts of kinslaying, and as a result, both Princess Rhaenyra and King Aegon were consumed by grief, rage, and a bitter desire to see the other and all their supporters brutally exterminated. No longer was the Dance of Dragons a petty dynastic dispute which could be resolved with some clever politicking. Now, it was a fight to the death. Knowing that total war was on the horizon, Sir Otto Hightower, Hand of the King, intensified his desperate attempts to secure the oaths of the realm's most powerful lords. But the lords of the North and the Vale were firmly behind Rhaenyra, and the Greyjoys of the Iron Islands and the Martells of Dorne both snubbed the Royal Council's advances. Even in the Reach, where support for King Aegon was supposed to be the strongest, dozens of minor houses had declared for the Black Council, throwing the region into chaos. In the Riverlands, the Rhaenyra-aligned House Blackwood broke the power of Aegon-aligned House Bracken in a pair of actions at the Battle of the Burning Hill and the Taking of Stonehenge. With his pool of potential allies on the continent rapidly thinning out, Sir Otto Hightower began enticing the Kingdom of the Three Daughters, a triarchy of the city-states of Myr, Lys and Trioche, over to King Aegon's side, with promises of trade concessions. However, the Neo-Valyrian cities dragged their feet on their response, and growing frustrated with his grandfather's constant diplomatic shortcomings, King Aegon dismissed Sir Otto as Hand of the King, replacing him instead with the younger, more efficient, and more ruthless Sir Criston Cole. Sir Criston's counsel for King Aegon was simple: trying to secure the loyalty of Westeros' lords through diplomacy and the Olive Branch had clearly failed, so it was time to get through to them by way of the Targaryens' house words, fire and blood. Setting forth from King's Landing with dragons, an army, and his new hand at his side, Aegon began doing just that, subjecting the pro-black harbour town of Duskendale to a brutal sack. The royal campaign next proceeded to Rook's Rest, whose ruling house, the Stauntons, had also pledged loyalty to Rhaenyra. When Sir Criston arrived with the king's forces, he found Rook's Rest barred, and since Aegon and his dragon were ostensibly not with him at the time, the ruthless hand of the king resorted to pillaging his way throughout the hinterlands of Staunton territory. In desperation, Lord Staunton had a raven sent to Dragonstone, beseeching his liege Queen Rhaenyra to send out her dragon riders to save his fief. The queen acquiesced and sent her aunt Rhaenys riding atop the great drake Meleys. As it turned out, Sir Criston's real goal all along had been to draw out one of the Black Council's dragons. No sooner had Rhaenys and Meleys taken to the field than they were swept down upon by not one but two dragon riders, Prince Aemond atop Vagar and the king himself atop Sunfire. 1,000 feet in the air, the three giant beasts fought viciously, ducking and weaving amidst columns of searing dragon flame. While the Black Queen's aunt and her dragon were slain, King Aegon was severely burnt in the struggle, and Sunfire mortally wounded. The king would essentially be in a coma for the following year, and his dragon's combat utility was crippled. Consequently, Prince Aemond took his place as the functioning head of the Greens. Upon hearing of his wife Rhaenys' death, Lord Corlys Velaryon threatened to abandon Rhaenyra's cause, and had to be mollified by Prince Jacaerys, who made him Hand of the Queen. After settling that matter of state, Prince Jacaerys turned his attention to the Blacks' unmanned dragons. After the deaths of Lucerys and Rhaenys, the Blacks had 9 dragons left, but only 3 had riders. Wanting to attack the capital with as many dragon riders as possible, Jacaerys looked far and wide for bastards of Targaryen lineage, whose illegitimate status had condemned them to life as lowborns, but whose blood may allow them to tame the presently masterless dragons. Many glory seekers from across the Seven Kingdoms answered Jacaerys' call. Most ended up as a giant lizard's aperitif, but after many deaths, new riders emerged. The dragon Vermithor was claimed by Hugh Hammer, the son of a blacksmith, Silverwing by a humble man-at-arms named Ulf White, Seasmoke by the 15-year-old Adam of Hull, and Sheepstealer by a girl named Nettles, the daughter of a dockside whore. While Jacaerys was arming peasants with giant sentient napalm machines, Queen Rhaenyra had taken the safety of her remaining children in mind. Given all the brutal kinslaying going on lately, she had her 2 youngest sons, Viserys aged 8 and Aegon the Younger aged 10, on a ship to Pentos, where she hoped they could wait out the rest of the war in safety. This would not play out as she hoped. While crossing the narrow sea, the ship carrying the 2 princes happened upon 90 warships of the combined navies of Lys, Myr and Tyrosh, who, as it turned out, had decided to ally with the Greens after all. Naturally, the Associ ships attempted to capture the boys. Frantically mounting his young dragon Stormcloud, young Aegon was able to fly back to Dragonstone, although his dragon was mortally wounded by Lycian ballistae in the attempt, and would die soon after. Viserys, meanwhile, who possessed only a dragon egg, was captured by the Lycian admiral, Sharako Lahar. Immediately spirited back to Essos, he would spend the rest of the war in comfortable captivity. Enraged, Prince Jacaerys, flanked by his ascendant peasant dragon riders, mounted up and descended upon the Associ fleet with a fury. They did not have to fly far, for Admiral Sharako had already arrived upon the shores of Dragonstone, where he had subsequently ambushed and done great damage to Lord Corlys Velaryon's fleet. Upon pillars of dragonflame, Jacaerys and his dragon seeds eviscerated the navy of the Three Sisters. But in what was becoming a running theme, their victory would be a costly one. During the battle, Jacaerys flew too low, and his dragon was entrapped by grapnels and scorpion bolts, getting caught in the rigging of a sinking ship and drowning. Jacaerys himself would perish amidst a hail of Myrish crossbow bolts. Following what became known as the Battle of the Gullet, Queen Rhaenyra had eliminated King Aegon's principal source of naval power, but had lost her eldest son and heir and yet another dragon in the process. Although both sides were rapidly losing manpower, leaders and morale, the war raged on unabated. At Honeywine, the main Green army in the Reach, led by Ormond Hightower, was thrown into peril when it was pincered between 2 black forces, led by Thaddeus Rowan and Tom Flowers. Surrounded and on the brink of annihilation, the Lord Hightower's salvation came in the form of the dragon Targaryen, commanded by Prince Daeron, King Aegon's genteel younger brother. The Green Council received news of this victory boisterously, but the reach was not their principal concern at the present. To King Aegon's councillors, the main black threat was the ever-deadly Prince Daemon, presently garrisoned with his dragon at Harrenhal. To that end, Prince Aemond and Ser Criston launched a northwards campaign with ground troops and dragons alike, with the intent to recapture Harrenhal, only to discover that upon arrival, the massive citadel was abandoned and Daemon nowhere to be seen. The Green reclamation of the largest castle in the Riverlands turned the entirety of central Westeros into an active battleground. It was here the Lannisters, allied with the Greens, joined the fray with a host of some 8,000 men, defeating the black-aligned Western Riverlords at the battles of the Red Fork and Acorn Hill. However, in these triumphs, the Lord Jason Lannister was slain, as was his most capable commander, Adrian Tarbeck. This left the leadership of the Lannister host in the hands of the elderly, infirm and incapable Lord Humphrey Lefford, who would ultimately lead his army to its doom. Upon reaching as far east as the God's Eye, the Lannister host had found itself deeply overextended, and as a result, enemies had begun moving in on all sides. To the north, the warlord Roderick Dustin had crossed Moat Cailin with 2,000 of House Stark's Winter Wolves, whereupon he had crossed the Twins and been joined by 200 knights and 600 men-at-arms of Lord Forrest Frey, and 300 crackshot archers from Raventree Hall. Meanwhile, to the south, the Riverlords defeated by the late Jason Lannister had regrouped under the leadership of his killer, Sir Pate of Longleaf. Finally, in the immediate west, yet more black-supporting Riverlords, such as Garibaldi Grey, John Charlton and Benjicott Blackwood, had mustered together a coalition force. Overall, the Lannister force was being encroached upon on 3 sides, and had a lake, the God's Eye, to their back. Realizing his perilous situation, Lord Humphrey sent raven after raven to nearby Harrenhal, where Prince Aemond and his dragon still occupied the castle, unaware of his allies' predicament. However, these ravens were all shot down by the expert marksmen of Raventree Hall. The next morning, the battle was joined, with Lord Dustin's Winter Wolves leading the charge into Lannister lines. Drawing up into a square phalanx with their backs to the river, the Lannister bannermen held the line, even as the Freys and the Riverlords joined the fray, forcing them to fight on all sides. 5 times the allied Black Coalition crashed against Lannister spears, and 5 times they were repulsed. However, each time the Blacks attacked, the Lannister phalanx was pushed closer and closer to the water's edge. Finally, those in the back were pushed into the lake and began drowning in their armor. A panic ensued, which evolved into a general rout, leading to the entire Lannister army being slaughtered or drowned. The battle by the lakeshore was the bloodiest single conflict in the Dance of the Dragons, with Maester records estimating anywhere between 2,000 to 10,000 casualties. With the entire Lannister army annihilated, the ever-opportunistic Iron Islanders took to their longboats, allying with Queen Rhaenyra and beginning to mercilessly plunder the now undefended coastlines of the Westerlands. With many of the Green's principal allies crippled, and Lord Aemond and Ser Criston's main army overstretched in Harrenhal, the capital of King's Landing had been left largely undefended. Seeing a golden opportunity before her, Queen Rhaenyra mounted atop Syrax, accompanied by her uncle-husband Daemon riding atop Caraxes. While the 2 massive dragons approached the Red Keep from the landward side, Lord Corlys Velaryon sailed into the gullet and blockaded the city by sea. From inside the city, Queen Mother Alicent scrambled to organize a desperate defense, but with few troops and no dragon riders at her disposal, there was nothing she could do. Knowing she had no other recourse, Alicent surrendered the city to Rhaenyra. In return for handing over Queen's Landing bloodlessly, the Queen Mother was spared, as was her daughter-in-law Queen Helena. But her father, Otto Hightower, alongside many other lords, were not so lucky. The capital now secured, Queen Rhaenyra took her seat upon the Iron Throne of Westeros. The loss of the capital sent Ser Criston and Aemond reeling, and they decided to respond by splitting up. Sir Criston would head south to reinforce Ormond Hightower in the Reach. Aemond, meanwhile, would mount atop Vagar and proceed upon a spree of utter devastation, putting the Riverlands to the torch, hoping this carnage might draw out one of the Black's dragon riders to face him. Proceeding south in Aemond's wake, Sir Criston's armies witnessed nothing but a blackened, dead land. That is, until they reached Crossed Elms, where they were ambushed by Lord Dustin's Winter Wolves and the River Lords. In what would later become known as the Butcher's Ball, Sir Criston was slaughtered alongside the rest of his army. This was the high point for Rhaenyra in the war. She held the capital, had crippled the Green's armies in battle after battle. Yet these triumphs would be fickle things, and the Black Queen's triumphs would soon turn to ashes in her mouth. Despite their many losses, one relatively intact army of the Greens remained, that of Ormond Hightower. Despite the odds, Lord Hightower, accompanied by Prince Daeron and his dragon Tessarion, had scored a string of victories against Black's supporters in the Reach, and was now advancing upon King's Landing. En route, they found out that the townsfolk of Bitterbridge had killed the king's youngest son, Maelor Targaryen, who had passed through there after being smuggled out of King's Landing following its fall. In a vengeful fury, Daeron subjected the town to a brutal sack. To deal with Ormond and Daeron's advance, Rhaenyra deployed an army and 2 of the Dragon Seeds, Ulf the White and Hugh Hammer, to hold the line at the town of Tumbleton. However, when Ormond and Daeron arrived upon the town, it was clear their force greatly outnumbered the Blacks within the walls. Hedging their bets, the 2 former peasants-turned-dragon riders turncoated and switched sides to help sack the town. In the ensuing battle, Ormond Hightower was slain, but the Greens were victorious. Upon hearing of Ulf and Hugh's betrayal, Queen Rhaenyra began questioning the loyalty of the other 2 Dragon Seeds, Nettles and Adam of Hull. She ordered them arrested, but due to the covert aid of Corlys Velaryon, who had since adopted Adam as a member of his house, the pair managed to escape with their dragons. As punishment for undermining her orders, Rhaenyra had Corlys imprisoned. The Black Queen would suffer another setback when King Aegon II finally made his reappearance. Having been smuggled out of King's Landing some time ago, he had since recovered from the wounds he'd suffered at Rook's Rest. He landed on the barely garrisoned Dragonstone, where he was found by the still-wounded Sunfire. Together, the reunited dragon and rider seized Dragonstone, ironically making it so that both factions had gained the enemy's capital but lost their own. While all this was happening, Daemon had returned to Harrenhal, and Aemond was still ravaging the Riverlands. Eventually, the 2 agreed to a duel above the God's Eye. There, the mightiest dragons and dragon riders on either side of the war clashed, mano a mano. According to legend, this thunderous face-off ended when Caraxes and Vagar became locked wing in claw and began plummeting down towards the lake, but not before Daemon leapt from his dragon onto Aemond's and speared his foe through the eye with the Valyrian sword Dark Sister. Both mighty dragons would die in this duel, as would Aemond. Daemon too likely perished, although his body was never found. Meanwhile, back in King's Landing, Queen Rhaenyra's once unshakable footing had begun to dissolve beneath her like so much sand. Queen Helaena, inconsolable after the traumatic deaths of both her young sons, threw herself from Maegor's holdfast, dying in the moat below. Convinced that Rhaenyra had ordered Helaena killed, and beginning to lose confidence that she could protect them from Prince Daeron's approaching army, the small folk of the city began to riot. The mob rapidly grew, fanning out feverishly through the city streets and devouring the force of gold cloaks sent to pacify it. The Black Queen was left without the manpower to quell the rioting, for after learning they had imprisoned their lord, Corlys, the Velaryon fleet abandoned her, depriving her of half her army. All order and good sense evaporated as amidst the carnage, a crazed prophet, known as the Shepherd, began rallying the mob with sermons against dragons, claiming they were demon spawn of the heathen goddess Valyria and the doom of men. Soon he had corralled a massive group of small folk and led them to the Dragon Pit, the massive cavernous building where the Targaryens' dragons were held. Stuck in their pens and unable to fly, the dragons were caught helpless, and although they incinerated many a peasant, they were eventually swarmed upon and put down. 4 worms, Shrikos, Morgul, Tyraxes and Dreamfire perished that day, as did Queen Rhaenyra's third son, Prince Joffrey, who was thrown off the back of his mother's dragon in his futile attempt to ride to the rescue of his own dragon Tyraxes. Subsequently, Syrax, the Black Queen's bonded mount, also died amidst a swarm of riders. Having lost many of her supporters, her son and her dragon, Rhaenyra was forced to flee King's Landing. Back in Tumbleton, the dragon seed Hugh had since developed grandiose ambitions of seizing the throne for himself, but he would never get the chance, for the city was ambushed by his fellow dragon seed Adam, who hoped that by killing the two betrayers, he could prove his loyalty to Queen Rhaenyra and have the arrest order on him rescinded. This would not go as planned, for Adam would die in the fighting. However, he would take both Hugh and Ulf and their dragons down with him. Prince Daeron would also perish, making the Second Battle of Tumbleton yet another Pyrrhic disaster where both sides lost valuable leaders and dragons. Rhaenyra, meanwhile, had arrived back on Dragonstone, only to find an unpleasant surprise waiting for her, King Aegon II and Sunfire. Here, the Black Queen, whose rebellion had caused the deaths of so many thousands, would meet her end, roasted to a crisp and devoured by Sunfire, who, ancient and tired, died of his long-standing wounds just days later. His arch-nemesis defeated, Aegon proceeded to King's Landing. The city was still in chaos, and the mob had since crowned a random squire, Trystane Truefire, to be their king, on the grounds that he was the late King Viserys' bastard son. However, the forces of Lord Boros Baratheon cleared the rabble out for King Aegon, allowing him to reclaim the Iron Throne. For all intents and purposes, Aegon II had won, but just like Rhaenyra's ostensible victory before him, his triumph would be bitter and fleeting. Although Rhaenyra was dead, her loyalists fought on, seeking to rescue her son, Aegon the Younger, who was presently in King Aegon's captivity, and install him as king to honour what in their eyes was the true succession. At the Battle of the King's Road, a Blacks-aligned coalition of Stark and Tully forces crushed Lord Boros Baratheon's army and advanced upon King's Landing. With Aegon lacking the manpower to face them, the public mood began to turn against him. Some days later, King Aegon Targaryen, second of his name, was found dead in his chambers by way of tainted wine. To this day, no one has figured out who the poisoner was. Thereafter, Queen Rhaenyra's son, Aegon the Younger, was crowned as King Aegon Targaryen, third of his name. With the son of the Black Queen now occupying the Iron Throne, the Dance of the Dragons ended, ostensibly with a victory for the Blacks. However, the Dance of Dragons was a loss for the Targaryen dynasty, and its power and influence over the realm of Westeros. The blood of old Valyria had been dangerously thinned out, as many true-blooded sons and heirs of Targaryens in both the Black and Green camps had died during the war. More consequentially, their dragons, the cornerstone of Targaryen power, had all been annihilated. Out of a total pre-war population of 18, only 2 remained. Indeed, what began as a petty dispute of succession within a royal house with unchallenged dominance over the realm would lead to a pointless war which would sow the seeds of that house's eventual fall some 150 years later during Robert's Rebellion. That war, however, is still a ways off, and although House Targaryen was absolutely weakened, it would continue to rule Westeros for many decades to come. During this time, more wars and intrigue would ensue, the next ones of any note being the subjugation of that one pesky princedom which thus far had eluded Targaryen rule for nearly 200 years, and another civil war that would follow in its wake, the Blackfyre Rebellion. Aegon I's conquest of Westeros stalled during the attempted invasion of Dorne, and his sister wife Rhaenys, as well as her dragon Meraxes, perished in the fighting. For a century and a half after the conquest, Dorne continued to resist invasions and incursions. In 158, Daeron I conquered Dorne, but their guerrilla tactics and deception led to his death in 161 after he was invited to faux peace negotiations. After the death of the young king, his brother Baelor I became king and made peace with Dorne, which had now regained its independence. Upon his return to the capital at King's Landing, Baelor imprisoned his 3 sisters in the newly built Maiden Vault of the Red Keep. One of them, Dana, continuously escaped from captivity and eventually became pregnant, giving birth to a son, Daemon Waters, in 170 AC. The incredibly pious Baelor I fasted for 40 days and nights after discovering this, and perished as a consequence. In 171, he was succeeded by his uncle, Viserys II. This competent monarch had 3 children, a frail and pious daughter, Nerys, the noble dragon knight, Aemon, and the handsome but irresponsible Aegon. After a year of rule, King Viserys II died, supposedly of natural causes, but rumours persist that he was poisoned by his son Aegon, who succeeded as Aegon IV in 172. He immediately began to rule in an arbitrary and careless fashion, filling his court with opportunists, sycophants, and women who would allow the king to satisfy his lusts with them. He would appropriate land from one noble house, only to grant it to another family which had earned his favour on a whim. This caused immense dissatisfaction among the nobility of Westeros. The most damaging impact on the realm would become obvious in 182. The bastard Daemon Waters was an incredibly competent warrior, and supposedly looked the spitting image of Aegon I. At 12 years old, he was knighted by Aegon IV, becoming the youngest knight in Westerosi history. Then, in an act that surprised everyone, he granted the ancestral Valyrian steel blade Blackfyre to Daemon, revealing him to be his bastard son. After this, Aegon's 29-year-old trueborn son, Daeron, began to actively oppose his father's rule, and a core of similarly minded nobles began to form around him. This opposition caused a quarrel between the prince and his father, and the king purposefully questioned the legitimacy of his son. In 184, when Aegon lay on his deathbed, he legitimized his many bastard sons, including the popular Daemon Waters, who then took the name Blackfyre. After he did this, Aegon IV died and was succeeded by Daeron II. The Crown Prince received news of his father's death in Dragonstone, and within a fortnight was crowned by the High Septon in the Red Keep. In order to proclaim his legitimacy, the new king also wore his father's crown. Daeron immediately set to work undoing the worst of his father's excesses, removing the inept and corrupt members of the late king's small council and replacing them with wise and capable men. He also attempted to address the rot within the city watch, which Aegon IV had let fall into disrepute and decay. Despite his father's appalling treatment of him, Daeron would not undo Aegon's last wishes and delegitimize his bastard half-brothers. Instead, he attempted to stabilize the realm by treating them honorably, allowing them to get the incomes from their lands. The principal great bastard, Daemon Blackfyre, was wed to Rahan of Tyrosh as Aegon had wished. On their wedding day, Daeron granted Daemon a tract of land near the Blackwater and the permission to raise a castle of his own. It is possible that the king did these things because he was kind and just. However, others say that he did them to assert his rule and legitimacy. Whatever the motivation, these efforts eventually proved to be in vain. Another key aspect of Daeron's reign was the final unification of the Seven Kingdoms. After 2 years of negotiation with Dorne, an agreement was reached. Daeron's sister Daenerys was to be joined in marriage with Prince Marin Martell, while Daeron would marry Marin's sister Maria. The princes of Dorne maintained many privileges and rights, as well as maintaining their own laws and tax collection. In 187, Prince Marin knelt and swore his oaths to the Iron Throne. Many Westerosi nobles were now dissatisfied, as it was widely believed that Dorne had gained too many concessions and privileges, and that Dornish nobles had too much influence at court, encouraged by Queen Maria. Knights and lords who had been used to intermittent warfare with Dorne still held their old animosities, and began to distrust the peacemaking king. In addition, there were still questions raised about Daemon's legitimacy due to the rumours spread by his late father. All of these factors played a part in sowing the seeds of rebellion, and these would grow over the following decade. Many of the dissatisfied lords and knights of the realm would seek out the exemplary Daemon Blackfyre. Two of these nobles, another bastard of Aegon IV, Aegor Bittersteel Rivers, and Sir Quentyn Fireball Ball, played a key role in convincing Daemon that he was the rightful heir, and the latter gradually became convinced that he should claim the throne. The young Blackfyre himself had ample reason to be dissatisfied. The status of a bastard began to anger him, and there were rumours that the marriage of Daenerys, whom he loved, caused him to loathe King Daeron. In the early weeks of 196, Daeron received word that his half-brother intended to declare himself king within a month. It is not known how this knowledge reached him, but it is likely that another of the great bastards, Brynden Rivers, alerted him. As soon as the king was informed of Daemon's intentions, he dispatched his elite guard, the King's Guard, to arrest the would-be usurper before his plans could progress any further. However, Daemon was forewarned by Sir Quentyn Ball. With his help, the claimant to the throne escaped the capital. Those who supported Blackfyre's claim used this attempted arrest as the catalyst for war, claiming that the king had acted against his brother out of nothing more than baseless fear. It was this final event that ignited the first Blackfyre rebellion in 196. Daemon raised the reverse Targaryen banner, showing a black dragon on a red field. The rebels then declared for Daemon Blackfyre, first of his name, proclaiming him the true eldest son of Aegon IV. Half the realm declared for the rebels, and half remained loyal to the king, with a patchwork of houses remaining neutral. Meanwhile, Lord Bracken, who supported Daemon, had travelled across the Narrow Sea in order to hire Myrish crossbowmen and other mercenaries. Fighting broke out across the Seven Kingdoms almost immediately, except for in the north, which was ambivalent to the internal squabbling of the south. In the west, Sir Quentyn Ball commanded an army attacking the Westerlands, and managed to win 2 battles in that region, killing Lord Lefford at the gates of Lannisport, and then defeating Lord Daemon Lannister almost immediately afterwards. After turning south, Fireball, as he was commonly known, also defeated a loyalist force at the Manda River, and killed almost all of Lady Penrose's sons. Further south in the Reach, the loyalist Leo Tyrell fought against traitorous forces in that region and won many victories. Despite that, the Blackfyre forces kept Leo occupied, and he was unable to march north in time for the final battle. In 196, after almost a year of open rebellion across the Seven Kingdoms, the usurper Daemon gathered his forces and marched towards King's Landing. In response, Prince Maekar Targaryen organized the nearby loyalist forces into a coherent force and went to confront the rebels, while Prince Baelor traveled south in the hopes of rallying Stormlanders and Dornish forces to assist. The two armies met on a plain near the capital, with the high Weeping Ridge anchoring their flanks. The numbers of troops at the Battle of the Redgrass Field are unknown, but it is widely believed the initial armies were in balance. Both forces had a vanguard of heavy knights in the centre, with another smaller contingent of lighter cavalry on the wings and infantry behind. Lord Donal Arryn commanded the Loyalist van, with the Kingsguard Lord Commander Gwaine Corbray at his side. Meanwhile, Prince Maekar commanded the infantry from behind his line. The Loyalists also had the elite skirmishing force of Brynden Rivers, the Raven's Teeth, fighting for them. Meanwhile, the enemy force was under the command of Daemon Blackfyre and his 2 sons at the point of his vanguard, with Aegor Bittersteel Rivers on the right and Lord Costane on the left. The usurper began the battle by charging with his vanguard into the Loyalists' cavalry front line. Daemon and his elite warriors were unstoppable, cutting the opposing vanguard to pieces and scattering the remains to the rear. As this happened, a famous duel occurred between the usurper and Sir Gawain Corbray, both fighting with Valyrian steel swords. The fight went on for many minutes, before Daemon managed to severely injure his opponent, leaving him blind and bleeding. Rather than breaking the loyalist line, he then stopped in his tracks, ordering his men to take the honourable Sir Gawain to the rear so he could receive medical assistance. By this time, Brynden Rivers and his elite company of archers had mounted the Weeping Ridge and stood ready to attack. Seeing the Blackfyre assault succeeding, he ordered his longbowmen to rain arrows down around the reversed Targaryen banner. Daemon's elder son Aegon perished first under the hail of missiles, followed by Daemon himself. His younger son Aemon then took up Blackfyre, but Brynden slew him as well. With their leaders and vanguard decimated by the loyalist archers, the rebels gradually began to flee. However, Aegor Rivers, who had commanded the right flank at the beginning of the battle, was able to rally the fleeing soldiers into a countercharge at the royal forces, while he fought a duel with Brynden Rivers and took one of his eyes. It appeared for a moment as if this might break the royal forces, but then war horns were heard from the rear. Prince Baelor had entered the battlefield with a host of Dornish and Stormlanders and crashed into the rebels from behind. At the same time, Prince Maekar ordered his army to charge the enemy front, which crushed them between his anvil and Baelor's hammer. 10,000 men died on the red grass field, a victory which ended the First Blackfyre Rebellion and secured King Daeron's rule. However, Aegor Rivers managed to flee the battle and escaped to Essos, where he would form the Golden Company mercenary group. He also took with him the 5 surviving sons and several daughters of the dead Blackfyre claimant. While the first rebellion had been quelled, the Blackfyre pretenders continued to plague the Seven Kingdoms until Maelys the Monstrous died at the hands of Sir Barristan Selmy in 260 AC. The Blackfyre rebellions, along with the final demise of the dragons, weakened the Targaryen dynasty and made it vulnerable to those ambitious enough to challenge them. But the real end of the Targaryen dynasty came with Aerys II, whose reign started off well but became worse with his progressing madness, leading to the rebellion led by Robert Baratheon, supported by Jon Arryn and Eddard Stark. The events of this rebellion and their aftermath are covered in our other series on the history of the world of Ice and Fire, and you can find a link to that video in the description. We're planning to cover the battles of many other fantasy, sci-fi and space opera universes, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing as it helps immensely, and don't forget to comment. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to know what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.